Hey, if you're still awake, tonight I wanted to talk about grace because I think a lot of people spend years trying to earn something that was never meant to be earned. Forgiveness, compassion, understanding, grace. We treat it like a reward, something we'll receive once we suffered enough, once we fixed enough, once we became better. But I don't think that's grace. I think that's punishment wearing a different name. And that leads me into the internal courtroom. I think many people live inside a courtroom, not a real courtroom, an internal one, a place where old mistakes are replayed, re-examined, re-enlightened, over and over again. Every regret becomes evidence. Every failure becomes testimony. Every embarrassing moment becomes another exhibit. And somehow, just somehow, we're always the defendant, always guilty, always on trial. We replay conversations from years ago. We imagine better responses, better decisions, better outcomes. We think, if only I had known, if only I had listened, if only I had waited. But the trial never ends because hindsight is undefeated. Hindsight always wins. It always knows more. It always sees more. And if we're not careful, we'll spend years prosecuting a version of ourselves that no longer exists. Judging yesterday with today's wisdom. I think one of the most unfair things we do to ourselves is judge our past selves using knowledge we didn't have at the time. We look backward with experience, wisdom, perspective, maturity, then criticize the person who lacked all those things. Of course, you will make different choices today. You're a different person today. That's what growth is. But growth becomes impossible when every lesson becomes another reason to hate yourself. The version of your back. Let me repeat that. The version of you back then wasn't trying to ruin your life. They were trying to survive it. They were trying to understand it. They were trying to navigate circumstances they hadn't seen before. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth remembering. The difference between accountability and shame. Accountability says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. Accountability says, I need to learn. Shame says, I don't deserve to grow. Accountability creates movement. Shame creates paralysis. Accountability asks, what can I do differently? Shame asks, what's wrong with me? And those questions lead to very different lives and very different answers. Because one creates healing, the other creates hiding. That's why we refuse ourselves grace. I think most people are far kinder to strangers than they are to themselves. We forgive friends, encourage family, offer understanding to people we barely know. Yet, when it comes to ourselves, compassion disappears. Suddenly, perfection becomes the requirement. Suddenly, mistakes becomes unforgivable. Suddenly, growth becomes insignificant. And I think that's because somewhere along the way, many of us started believing suffering was necessary, that guilt was proof that we cared. The punishment was proof we learned. But endless punishment doesn't create wisdom. It creates exhaustion. Because grace begins here. Maybe grace begins with a simple truth. You were human, not perfect, not finished. Human. You were learning, growing, adapting, surviving, becoming. And maybe being human was never something that required punishment. Maybe it required understanding. Now, let's take a little break here. Do you guys notice how smooth that transition was from word to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph? It was extremely smooth. No mistakes. Well, a few mistakes because I'm human. But little to no effort. Smooth, easy, right to the point. I don't know what kicked that off, but I really did enjoy it. I enjoyed hearing my own voice, and that's rare. I really don't like hearing myself speak, or I don't like hearing myself in general. Because I constantly hear myself, right? Internally, of course. In my head, of course. To that talking voice in my head, whoever that is. Of course. But man, that was a smooth 5 to 6 minutes. It's really smooth, soft voice. My voice wasn't even that deep. And it can get deeper and deeper and deeper. But I chose to choose a lighter, more speaking voice. Because we're talking about grace, and because grace requires light. Grace reminds me of light, and so maybe that's why my voice is so light when speaking this. But it can get deeper and deeper and deeper. But we're not using the deep voice. Obviously, I'm having fun speaking to you guys, right? I'm having fun speaking to you guys. That's why you can probably hear me smiling or a little bit laughter, right? A little bit, of course. I digress. Let me not get too ahead of myself. Although I'm having fun speaking, we should pull it back to the point, right? Because we're talking about grace, right? That was the whole point, I believe. What threw me off was that a notification on my laptop went off because it's connected to my phone. And so I don't know if it picked that up. The microphone picked it up. I hope it didn't. But if it did, it is what it is. So I ask you, the listener, from me, the speaker, a couple of questions. What mistakes are you still carrying? What version of yourself are you still putting on trial? What would happen if you spoke to yourself the way you speak to someone you love? Grace isn't pretending mistakes never happened. Grace is refusing to let those mistakes become your identity. Growth requires honesty, but healing requires grace. And eventually, both have to exist together. Because if they do, you will learn that your mistakes were just lessons to be learned. And you're allowed to offer yourself a level of grace that is worth you, your value, your time, and your protection. I really do like that, because if you don't offer yourself grace, who will? Usually the world doesn't. You can go in this world by yourself, walk every day by yourself, and no one will offer you grace. So you have to allow yourself grace in order to heal, in order to grow, in order to move forward. If you're still awake tonight, remember, you can learn from your past without living inside of it. The room will reopen on Thursday nights. I'll leave the light on for you.